Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome back to another podcast. Today is February 4th, 2020, and this is a bonus podcast. This is in response to the podcast that I published yesterday. A couple of you asked me to clarify this podcast. Apparently, it's confusing. So I'm recording this particular entry just to make up for that podcast, just to clarify the concept. Now, in the previous podcast, I talked about time in 3 points, because the common understanding is that time is linear. Time goes from point A to point B and to point C. And most of you understand these 3 segments as past, present, and future. In this podcast, at least in the podcast 43, I argue that this is not the case at all. In fact, time does not go from point A to point B to point C. Time is not linear as it is understood. Time is not this space continuum where it goes from one point to another. Time is a constant. A constant, that means it is always bursting out of the thin air, okay? So to understand time from this perspective, let us look at time. Let us look at time that way. Suppose we're talking about a second. Okay, let's look at it from this perspective. Let's say we have 2 seconds or 3 seconds, right? The first second is the initial time, okay? Pew, that's the second. Pew, that's the second. Pew, that's the third. Let's do this again. 3 seconds. Boom, 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 right? So we have 3 seconds. What I am saying is that when you look at time, it does not go from the past to the present and into the future. Rather, it goes from the past and into the future directly. The time, at least the instance it takes from the past and into the future, is the present. That little in between the first second to the second second, that's the present, okay? Because when you have the first second, let us say that after the first second, everything stops. Let me give you that example. Let me illustrate that. Boom. Everything stops. If there is no second, then at this point we're talking about being frozen in time. So everything is frozen. And if everything is frozen, that means there's no time. Okay, time stops. Okay, that's the whole idea. From the first second to the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth to the sixth to the seventh and so on, then we're talking about time. But time itself is not anticipated from a linear standpoint. That's why time is flexible. That's why time is fluid, right? So what is time to this context, or at least within this context, may not be time within that context. Now, if we're looking at time from a linear standpoint, then the understanding is always going to be the same: past, present, and future. So what does that assume? That assumes that time starts, it gets to this point, it goes to that point, and that continuity, or that continuum, if you will, that's what time is. And that's what I'm arguing to the contrary here. Time is never continuum. It is instantaneous. In other words, The minute it is time, or at least the second it is time, the next second is going to determine whether or not it continues. Again, let me illustrate that. Going back to the concept of those 3 seconds. First second, at the minute the first second strike, it is the present. The next second strikes, then we're talking about the future, right? Because the initial second is only the initial second so long as there's no seconds. Does that make sense? There's no other second, right? The first second, the second you have the second, or once you have the second, then we have time. Okay, let me do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we're talking about time, but the only time it is when there is a second. If we only have one, then time would be frozen, and there wouldn't be any time. It would just be an instant. We could say it's an instant in time. But the first second strike, the next second, that's what's going to determine the time. And in order to get to the second, we have to get to the constant where the second has to be based on the first second. That initial back and forth, if you will, that's what time is. No? Doesn't make sense still? Let me clarify one more time. First second, second, third second, fourth second, fifth second, sixth second. So as long as it continues on that path, we have time. Now, in the real world, time is not based on seconds, right? In the real world, time is not second per se. Now, second is a way of illustrating time, okay? But in the real world, let's assume that you were somewhere in the vast universe, or in the nothingness, as Sartre would put it. Let's say you were in the nothingness. Let's say you were in a void where there is no way of counting time, or of having a step on time. Then second would be irrelevant, okay? All you would know is the instance in which you exist. So long as you exist, then time continues. Of course, when we're talking about a human being, human beings have what I call a natural biological clock, or a natural biological timer in them. Of course, this is relative to their presence within the environment itself, because the minute you were born, the second you were born, your biological time is counting. At least the second you were conceived, okay? Your biological time is in motion, and that time is counting, and it is based on that time that you are going to exist, and your existence is also relative to that time continuum, so to speak, but not within the context of having a linear continuity. It's the idea that the next second, and the continuity of those seconds, that's what time is. But the continuity itself, again, that's where you have to understand what I'm saying. The continuity itself is not on a continuum standpoint, right? This continuity is based on a constant back and forth between what was and what is, and between what was and what is what could be. So between what was and what is, we have the present, and what could be is the future. And that's why the future is never attainable. That's why the future is always elusive, because the minute you become in that future, it's gone. It becomes your present, and as it becomes your present, it becomes your past. And the next instant in which you are experiencing that moment, it becomes again your present in time. To illustrate this, and going back to the initial recordings, because this idea about time came about as I was driving on the road from Villanova University to my house in Lancaster. So as I was driving, and I'm looking at the road itself. And what I realize is that as I went from one point to another, I am still within the same environment. So the only difference is that I perceive time differently because I am moving through time. I'm moving from one point to another. But if I were, for instance, a giant, and in one of my future podcasts, I will talk about that, the notion of relativity. But bear with me for a second to understand what I'm saying here. Let us say that I am a giant, okay, and I'm looking at that car driving on the road. And from my perspective, let's say that I'm standing somewhere in the sky and I'm looking at that car driving from one point to another. From my perspective, that car would still be on the same path. So I wouldn't be able to see that the car is going from one point to another, and because it's going from one point to another, that signifies that it is from a point in time at a different point in time. From my perspective, the car would just be moving within the same time frame. It's just like at some particular point within that time frame, the car is at that location, the car is at that location, that location, that location. But from where I am, I would still be seeing the car going from that. So in other words, I could look back and I could see where the car had been the second before, or the minute before, or the hour before, depending on how high I am in the sky. It's the same analogy we could use if you're looking at a little ant, walking across a platform. Let's say that I'm sitting on my desk and I'm looking at this little ant going from this point to this other point. And as the ant is going from point A to point B, for me, it's just like it's the same desk, right? I'm looking at the same desk, and the ant is going from one point to the desk to another. But looking at the desk as a whole, to me, there's no difference in time. It's just like I'm looking at the ant going from this point to that point. And as the ant goes through, the ant might perceive it's traveling, or at least it's travel from a different lens, because at a particular point in time the ant was in this location, and once the ant has left that location, the ant is going to be in a different location. From the ant's perspective, the location has changed in time, which assumes that time has changed. But from my perspective, looking at the ants on the desk, no, time has not changed. You're within the same time. It's just like you have found yourself on different spectrum on that time scale. Okay, so we could look at time from the same perspective. If we are to consider time as a linear concept, then all it means is that we're looking at time from an ant's perspective, this tiny little speck within a time frame, and then all we can see is the time before us, and we can think about the time we just experienced. But in this vast universe, time is not like that. Okay, time is not from point A to point B and from point B to point C. It's not linear. So in the vast universe, or the vast multiverse, however you wanna say it, is that time is this big, huge thing or huge entity where we are part of it. So if we're looking at time from that little angle, from that little perspective, from that little corner of this universe where we are, then it's going to make sense that time is linear, because it goes from the point we perceive it to the point, and it continues to the point where we continue perceiving it. But as a whole, if you're looking at the universe as a whole, that little time where we are, at least the little moment in time where we are perceiving time, does not necessarily define time as a linear concept. So when I say time is not past, present, and future, what I mean is that within the vast or the largest scheme of things, time is this constant. It is always there, but we sometimes experience it on a bit by bit basis. And because we experience time on a bit by bit basis, we have the perception, we have the understanding that time is linear and it goes from point A to point B to point C. And that's why you have so many misconceptions, particularly in popular culture, about time and the idea that time can go from this point to that point. Look, some of the things that I've said so far about time are going to be controversial because they're not aligned with popular mainstream about what time is. And that's why it's always fascinating when I hear those so-called scientists talk about time, and it's always fascinating to hear them talk. And you can see, or at least in my case, I can see that they're talking about time from a particular standpoint, from a particular perspective. It's like the ant talking about its time, and I, as a giant, looking at the ant, I'm like, no, ant, what you think about time, that's not what it is, because you're talking about the time you are experiencing, and that is not time itself. It is you experiencing time at a particular moment in time, but that does not define time itself. Time is vaster than that. It's bigger than that. It's larger than that. So if you're talking about time, if you want to understand time, you have to understand time within the context of time itself, not within the purview of your perception of time at a particular point in time. In other words, when we're talking about time, we have to take into account that time is not linear in the sense that it is not from one point to another. If we're looking at time from a point to another, that means we're looking at time from a linear standpoint, and that's wrong. We have to look at time as a constant. Now, it is possible that the universe itself is as one point to another, okay, but that we don't know. If we were able, at least if we could see the universe for what it is, then we could, say definitely what time is in and of itself. But we can understand time within the context of this vast thing. We can look at time in terms of this constant entity that allows things to be, this constant entity that allows other entities to exist, because without time nothing would exist. And if we are talking about existence itself, we have to understand time within the context of time, not within the context of the being who is existing as a result of time. So I hope this was able to clarify what I mean when I say time is not from point A to point B to point C. Because if we are looking at time on a linear spectrum, that means we are looking at time from our perspective, from our little understanding of what time is. Again, going back to the example about the ant is always going to see time from a linear standpoint because that's the time the ant is experiencing. However, a giant standing on the crest of this earth, or an entity standing outside of the planet, when that entity is looking at time, it is not looking at time from point A to a point B perspective, or at least that the range of the point A or point B or point C is much larger or much bigger than what an ant could perceive. So that relativity of time is something that I will talk about in a subsequent podcast, but for here I wanted to clarify it. So there's a constant, and that constant is when time, the initial time, it depends on the next strike of time. The first strike of time, or the first second, is relative to the second, the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth to the sixth, and so on. And in comparison to the initial second, then we can say, okay, we were at that point, now we are in this point, therefore we can anticipate that point. And that's the 3-point understanding about time, being from point A to point B and to point C. And in this example, point A would be the initial second, pow. Point B would be the second second, pow. And point C would be the third second, being pow. So the initial second, pow, is the present. The minute we have a second, that present becomes the past. And in anticipation of the third second, that becomes the future. And that's a particular understanding of time. Time is not like that. Time is this constant where it is constantly creating a loop, and in this constant from the past, at least from the initial second to the second, there's always an anticipation of a third, there's always an anticipation of a fourth, and that anticipation, that's what the future is. And because there's always an initial instance of time, every anticipation is the future. But in order to anticipate the future, we have to be in the constant of time. We have to be in this constant between what was and what is, and between what was and what is what gonna give you what could be. Therefore, past, present is not something separate. So the past and the present are always lived in the same moment. It's just you can conceive it or perceive it differently. Of course, we could talk about your memories or whatnot, but the past and the present are always within the same time, and the future is this anticipated future, and that's what gives you that constant. It goes from past to present. The minute it is present, it is past. The minute it is past, it becomes present. The minute it is past, it is present. The minute it is present, it becomes a future. So in this split second, this split moment, that's what gives you time, because it's this back and forth between the past and the present, and the past and the present, back and forth. That's what gives you the anticipation of the future. And that anticipation of the future, that's what time is. The minute you're experiencing that time, you're anticipating it, and you're anticipating it. That anticipation creates this back and forth between what was and what is, and that back and forth is what gives you that anticipation itself. And this is based on how I explain it, time. Again, if you still have confusion, please send me an email or contact me personally or directly, and I'll be glad to explain this concept for you a bit further. But again, like I said, time is a very difficult concept, so I don't expect you to understand it the way I'm putting it, and the way I understand time is somewhat, like I said, peculiar, different from other people. I'm assuming that I'm not the only one who sees time like this, but that's the way I sort of talk about it, and at least that's the way I sort of grasp the concept, and hopefully it will make sense to you as well. Anyway, if you still have questions, just reach out to me and I'll be glad to explain it to you further. I'll see you next week for the next podcast.